Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with reference recordings. Oh my, they are so referential indeed. Today we're talking about Brahms' Second Symphony, and this is a tough one. It's a little bit tricky because, as I've said before when we talked about Brahms first, where the reference recording was Klemperer, because it was granitic. The second is Brahms' most popular symphony. And not all of the Brahms symphonies have reference recordings, which is kind of, not surprising because they really widely differed in their popular acceptance. In Brahms's day, the first was not very popular at all. The second was vastly more popular. And the third and the fourth, they've always been a little bit out there. One of the reasons is because the third is the one that most people screw up, even major Brahms conductors, and it ends quietly. And the fourth is like a special autumnal, angry, tragic work. And for some reason, although there are marvelous performances of it, consensus did not emerge around a Brahms fourth that I can ever remember seeing happen. It really didn't happen. Some people, of course, will scream and yell and shriek about Furtwängler, but none of Furtwängler's Brahms performances became reference recordings, although some of them were thrilling, especially because the best of them were only released rather recently. I mean, they were live recordings and they weren't available. I mean, Furtwängler never made a Brahms cycle. I think we need to make that very, very clear from the very beginning. It was assembled later, and much later than the dates where these reference recordings actually came out. One of the reference people always was Toscanini, of course, because Toscanini recorded Brahms regularly, and the second was one of his specialties, actually. But he never quite got his brain around the third. As a cycle, anyway, there was always that. And there were always other people who were doing Brahms. All of the major German conductors were doing Brahms, and that kind of created attention. Forget Furtwängler for a minute. I mean, there were zillions of German conductors out there. But the one conductor who had undeniable authority in Brahms and whose second is the reference recording still is Bruno Walter. But also with a bit of a twist. You see, Bruno Walter was certainly around. I mean, he was around when Brahms was around, and he had a fabulous feeling for Brahms's music, and he recorded 2 splendid Brahms cycles, and they're just terrific for the most part. He made really one of the greatest ever, possibly the greatest recording of the Third Symphony, but nobody cared about the Third Symphony with the Columbia Symphony, and he has 2 splendid recordings of the second. One is his monocycle with the New York Philharmonic. Doesn't that look helpful? Look at this one. If you look really closely, you might see the word Brahms there on this rather, faded cover. It was supposed to look like it was carved in marble or something anyway. But this was his New York Philharmonic monocycle, and it's thrilling. My God, it's exciting. And then he remade all of them with the Columbia Symphony Orchestra. This is the cycle that has that amazing performance of the Third Symphony. This one has the fastest third you've ever heard in your life. This one really, I think, gets it right. And, by the time Walter was in his dotage, it wasn't dotage, his declining years, his late period, he still made wonderful recordings. I mean, he really did. He had become a little mellower and slowed down, but then again, he was always mellow. I mean, he was considered to be a gentle soul, a kind spirit, not one of those guys with tons and tons of fire in his belly. And because of that, he was somewhat taken for granted, and his performances were also taken with, let's put it this way. Shostakovich, let's change the subject for a second. Shostakovich said when they first heard his Fifth Symphony, that the finale was supposed to be optimistic and beautiful, and it turned the tragedy, the first movement, into open-hearted happiness and glee, and he discovered, as his many biographers and people who knew him attest, that when you tell people what they're supposed to hear, that's what they hear, because they don't want to think and they have no clue what they're listening to themselves. And the party apparatchiks showed up and they heard that the finale was noisy and bombastic at the end, and they said, aha, he did what we wanted. He wrote an optimistic ending. Well, it was something like that with Bruno Walter. Bruno Walter, people said, compared to some other conductors, which this was true, was comparatively soft-edged. He was schmoozy. He was pleasant. He didn't have the reputation as a human being, as one of those crazy dictatorial tyrants of the Rainer Zell mode. And he wasn't, trying to do transcendental falderall like Furtwängler was always doing. And he just didn't have that, he wasn't the stoic, granitic Klemperer type. He wasn't any of those things. He was gemütlich, as they say in Vienna, somewhat genial. And that everyone assumed that because of that, his music making was always like that. Well, if you listen to his recordings, and if you listen to them with an open mind, that's not true at all. I mean, when he wanted to be fiery and passionate, he was fiery and passionate. When you think about it, he was promoting Mahler, and he did really good Mahler. And you don't do really good Mahler if you're like a bland, milquetoasty kind of guy. And he wasn't. But he was also not one of these conductorial, crazy, wild-eyed psychotypes. Now, Brahms's music is not the kind of music that needs to be performed as if he were a wild-eyed, crazy psychotype. That's not the kind of music it is. It is classically poised. It is often restrained. That doesn't mean performances need to be, like I said, bland and underplayed and undercharacterized. And Walter didn't play them that way. He played them with plenty of energy and strength and passion and force. And the evidence is right there on the recordings. But as with Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, when it came to Walter's discography, people sort of felt he was better off in gentler music, that he was getting kind of a consolation prize for saying that, his Pastoral Symphony is the reference recording, which it is, but not because it's more pastoral. It's because it's less pastoral. It's because it's more exciting. It's because it's more cohesive. It's because it has more positive qualities. And the same is true with the Brahms second. Everybody knew that Walter's Brahms was as authentic and as idiomatic as anyone's Brahms could be. But they weren't going to give him credit for doing a great first symphony, although he did do a terrific first symphony. He really did. Or the fourth, which is splendid, or the third, which is the best ever, the Columbia Symphony third. No, he was going to get credit for doing the second because it's the most relaxed and genial of the Brahms symphonies, which fits the relaxed and genial character of conductor Bruno Walter. But when you listen to it, especially the first one with the New York Phil, my God, it's a volcano of energy. It's unbelievable, particularly the finale, which he doesn't quite replicate in the stereo version with the Columbia Symphony, which is very, very fine in all other respects. There is a tradition in Brahms' performance in the finale of the second where you speed up, like that, going into the coda. Now, Walter does it, Joachim did it, a couple other people do it. Almost everybody else gently accelerates. I mean, they'll push a little bit, but they're not going to be as techy and tasteless as to actually execute a crazy cellarando. Walter did, and Joachim did, and a couple other people did. But most of them actually held back. And, so Walter did both ways, both of which are equally legitimate. And you can pick the one that works for you best. I think both performances are simply outstanding, not for their, bucolicism or their Gemütlichkeit, but for their grip on the symphonic drama that unfolds in the development section of the first movement, on the beautiful nobilmente, as Elgar would have put it, theme that opens the slow movement, the perfectly judged tempo adjustments in the intermezzo, the third movement, and of course that just wonderfully buoyant and vivacious finale. They're splendid, splendid Brahms performances, and there's no way that you could argue about the quality of this second not being worthy of being a reference. But like I said, the reasons it's a reference have as much to do with who Walter was and how his character suited this particular music and his relationship to Brahms as they do the excellence of the performances themselves. There are certain extra musical issues that factored into this selection. But Brahms 2 with Walter was the one. back in the day. And, some of you who have been screaming and shrieking about the fact that these reference recordings don't talk about more modern recordings and all that stuff. Well, as I've said a million times, that's not the point. That's not what we're doing. We're talking about what the reference recording was when there was a genuine consensus about what that meant. And we could discern what the picks were with relative clarity, which you absolutely can't now. It's impossible. There are new reference recordings for these pieces, and maybe I'll do a little series about them. The new reference Brahms symphonies. That could be fun. It might be worth doing. But in the meantime, the reference recording for all time is the Bruno Walter Brahms Second, either with the New York Philharmonic or the Columbia Symphony Orchestra. Take your pick. And keep on listening. Thanks for joining me. Take care.